So you can see here that I defined this new section, and now I'm able to provide the content by using @section_footer. And if I go to the, oh, never mind. One of the questions people often ask me is, well, how do you provide default content? So I'll show you how you can do it today, and then when we get into the more advanced aspects of Razor, I'll show you how an even better way that you can write yourself that hopefully we'll do in the framework in the next version. So one of the things you can always check when you're in a layout is whether that layout is defined. So what I can do here is say @if so base.is section, okay. I don't need the base, I just forgot what it was. Is section defined footer. Oh, need to quote that. So if this section is defined, please render it. Otherwise, this is the default. So you can see here that the section is defined, so it's using that section. But if I go to index and delete this, we get the default behavior. And you can define multiple sections in a layout. And you can also have layouts that themselves require another layout, so nested layouts. We support all of that. Pretty much everything that you have in web pages with master pages, you can do with Razor in terms of nesting and grouping layouts. Now, the next thing I want to show you starts to get a little more advanced, but I think it's really interesting, which is the ability to use Razor to define delegates, like a func of something something. So just to show you an example of this, I'm going to use a code block. And it's a little bit of magic here. So if I define a func of dynamic and helper result, and notice that this first argument can be any type you want. And so I'll show an example of that later. Like, for example, we could give it a specific model type, but I'm just going to use dynamic because it's kind of easier. And I'll define a template. Let's maybe call it a player template. In fact, the player is actually a really good example of this. So jugador. So one of the things I need to do is I need the namespace. So since I'm going to use jugador often, what is this thing? Okay. I can actually use the @using and specify the namespace I'm using so that now you can see jugador turned blue and I can use it. So this is going to be a player template. Wow, sorry about that. And this is, let's put this on a new line so you can see it. And player template. Something's not quite right. Oh, so what was interesting there is in the past when you would build these like templates or like helper methods that return HTML, you would create a string and you do all this ugly string concatenation. Well, with Razor, that's kind of a thing of the past. So in fact, I'm so used to the old bad way of doing it that I started to use quotes, right? But with Razor, like you don't need the quotes. You just use the @ sign, and I'm back into markup mode within a code block. So I can do things like, span at item dot. And notice I'm getting IntelliSense here. So item.nombre, and I can do h1. I'm just kind of making stuff up here. Item.numero, right? And then what's great here is, notice I'm in here this for loop for each jugador. I can just call player template, pass in jugador, and nothing happens. Oh. You know what? I need to switch back to, let's wrap it in a div. There we go. So what's really cool here is I defined a delegate with a particular template using Razor instead of string concatenation, and then in a loop, I'm able to call that delegate. So let that sink in for a moment. The question you might ask is, well, why is this useful? What's an example of where this is really useful? Well, the part that makes this really useful is that any function that accepts a func of something, comma, helper result will be callable using Razor inline syntax. So, for example, if you were, the grid view helper actually uses this. And I'm going to write one, for an example, to render a section. So earlier, I showed you that when you define a section, you have this problem, right, that you can't define the default cleanly. So let's fix that up. I'm going to write a little utility class here. Let's get rid of the namespace. Just makes things easier. So helper result is a new class that was introduced as part of system.web.webpages. And it's a really nice way of returning markup to the view in a very efficient manner. And in this case, I'm going to call this method render section. And I'm going to make it an extension method of web page base. So this is the underlying base class for all Razor views. Page, and then string section name. And then func, let's go to full view, dynamic, comma, helper result. So one interesting thing, you notice I keep saying dynamic, comma, helper result. You could actually do dynamic here, and we'll figure it all out. But just to be explicit, I'll use the default content. Let me break that up a little bit just to make it clear. So what I'm saying here is I want to create a new overload of render sections so that you can specify the section name, and then you can pass in what the default content should look like. So the code here is pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty much the same code that I did in the layout. In fact, I'll just copy this. We just need to get rid of these @ signs, which mean nothing, to C#. So return default content null. Now I had to pass in null there because by default, when the delegate that Razor generates assumes you're going to pass in some object. In this case, we have nothing to pass into it, so I could just pass in null, and that's not a problem. OK, so the other change we need to make here is let's make sure we're passing in section name. Section name. So now when I go to layout, I can get rid of all this ugly stuff. And I have to use the this keyword because under the hood, what happens when we compile this view, or when we try to run this view, is that the Razor engine actually compiles it into a class that derives from, that it inherits web page view. And so since we're inside that class, if you understand extension methods, you have to use this dot to call an extension method that's in the same class that you are, or in the same hierarchy. So it's a little quirky, and it's just a little quirk of C#. It's one I find kind of annoying because people will typically go render section and look for their overload, and they won't see it. So in this case, I have to do this dot. But the beauty here, though, is now I can say, let's look. We can see my overload there that takes in a func, a dynamic helper result. So I can actually just pass in the actual content.